the nature of flash. Now, before we actually get into the nature of flash, let's talk about why we use flash. A lot of my students ask me, they say, why should I use flash? And from their perspective, they're right. They're used to coming into photography seeing flash as being a big, ugly maker, taking a potentially very nice photograph and just destroying it. And what I tell them is flash has amazing potential, and it's all about how you use it. And our goal in the next series, we're hoping to give over to you is the idea that flash is simply light, and by using light in the correct and right way, not only will you be able to create beautiful photographs, but you're also going to have the opportunity to create photographs that you've never been able to create by only using natural light. And that is something that we're going to see in the tutorial today. So before we learn how to use flash to create amazing and beautiful pictures, we first have to understand the nature of flash. What is it? How it works? How can we make it work for our pictures? So to do that, what we are going to do is we're going to pretend that we are in a room that's completely dark. There's going to be no light whatsoever. Now, go ahead and set your camera on a tripod, and let's say you want to go ahead and take a picture. So you take a picture, the picture's black. Let's say you need more light. So what do we normally do? Well, we widen our aperture, we raise our ISO, we drag our shutter speed, take a picture, still black. Let's say we start really dragging our shutter speed. We make a 5-minute exposure, an hour exposure, a 24-hour exposure. The point is that if there's no light in this room whatsoever, it doesn't matter how long our shutter is going to be open for. The picture is still going to be entirely black. So now let's say that we're going to have a shutter speed of 5 minutes. Now, while you're in the middle of taking this 5-minute exposure, you go ahead and take a 5-watt light bulb and you put it on for 30 seconds. What's that exposure going to look like? Well, the exposure is not going to have anything to do with the shutter speed. The exposure is only going to be based on how long that light bulb was lit for.
Now let's go ahead and shift gears for a moment and talk about the power of the light bulb.
Let's say we take the same picture now, push the shutter button, shutter opens for 5 minutes. Instead of having the light bulb on for what it was before, 30 seconds and 10 watts, we half the amount of time of the light bulb, so it goes to 15 seconds, and we double the wattage of the light bulb, it goes to 20 watts. So what's our exposure going to be now? Is it going to be any different than our original photograph? And the answer is no, because we reduced the amount of time the light bulb was on by a stop, but we increased the power by a full stop. So in the end, what we have is the same exposure we had before. And if we keep going with our example, what we're going to see is that by the time the light bulb is only on for 1/1000 of a second, the power of the light bulb is going to be so strong that it's going to give the same exposure as if the light bulb was on for 30 seconds at only 10 watts. Now this is flash. Flash is a very bright light that's only on for a very short duration. So we've spoken about the idea about how shutter speed doesn't have any effect on the exposure of something lit by flash. Let's see in the real world if this is really going to hold up, or it's only theoretical knowledge that doesn't really make a difference in our photography. And to do that, what we've done is we've set up a little studio here with 2 cute teddy bears. Now, there's no Photoshop here whatsoever. All this is 2 separate studios with a piece of black cardboard in the middle separating them, meaning that the light from the flash on the left side has no opportunity to spill over to the right side, and the constant light, the ambient light on the right side, has no opportunity to spill over to the left side. So in a sense, what we've done is we've created 2 separate studios completely separated with a black piece of cardboard paper in the middle. Now our shutter speed in this particular picture is 1/200. What's going to happen if we slow our shutter speed down? So armed with the information of what we've learned before, is the area being lit by flash going to get brighter? Well, it shouldn't, right? Because shutter speed doesn't have any effect on the exposure of flash. What about the area being lit by ambient light? Is that going to get brighter as we start to drag to slow our shutter speed? And the answer is of course. As we start to slow down our shutter speed, what we're seeing is the ambient side is getting brighter and brighter, while the flash side stays the same, until we get to the point where the ambient side is so overexposed that it's actually creating lens flare and filling the whole frame, but that really has nothing to do with the exposure of the flash. On the flip side, let's go ahead and change our aperture and see what's going to happen. As we change our aperture, we're seeing that both sides are changing. The aperture has an effect on both what's lit by flash and also what's lit by ambient light, and similarly, the ISO also changes both the ambient and the flash. So now, armed with that information, let's see what flash can do for our photography. So this here is a classic example of shooting when the dynamic range is completely outside of what a DSLR can handle. Now his face is exposed for properly, however the background is very washed out, and even the shirt is losing a little bit of detail. Now without flash, we're going to be very hard pressed to come up with a nice picture here. Yes, it's true, you could shoot in RAW, you could edit this in Lightroom and pull back some highlights. If you're a professional photographer though, what you're going to realize is that time is money, and the time that you spend editing a lot of these images may be not as efficient as if we would light it correctly in the first place. The second thing is that there's just a look with flash, a certain professional look that you just can't get any other way. So let's go ahead and talk about what we can do in this particular situation. Since shutter speed is something that only affects the ambient light, it only affects the constant light, not the flash, and since in this particular case we have too much ambient light, that means we're going to want to do something called crunching the shutter. That means we're going to be wanting to shoot at a fast shutter speed to limit how much ambient light to come in the camera. So here's an example of where the dynamic range is outside of what our normal DSLRs can handle. However, in this case, we're being very smart. We're going to use a fast shutter speed to limit how much ambient light we have coming into the picture, which helps us to get a good exposure for the background. And now all we have to do is we just have to add a little bit of flash from the front, and now we have an exposure that looks great. In this picture, again, the same idea. An impossible situation if we're only shooting with natural light. The background is simply too bright, the foreground is simply too dark. However, when we're using flash, we can use our shutter speed carefully again, use a fast shutter speed to limit the amount of ambient light coming in, and then simply use a bit of flash to balance the exposure properly. Let's see another example again, using a fast shutter speed to limit the ambient light in the background, adding a bit of flash from the front to make that exposure work. And one last example as well, getting a nice deep exposure for the sky, adding ambient light, and things look great. Now, of course, crunching our shutter, giving ourselves the fast shutter speed is not the only way we're going to be able to use flash. Also, we're going to be able to use flash where we slow our shutter speed down, add flash, and that's going to help us to pull out a lot of ambient light where maybe there wasn't so much ambient light before. Here we are after sunset. We do see a little bit of ambient light over the houses in the background. However, what we're going to see is as we keep on dragging our shutter speed, making it slower and slower, we're really able to pull a tremendous amount of ambient light when there wasn't any before. Let's go apply that now into our images. Here, for example, we see that we have a shutter speed of 1/13 to pull all this amazing ambient light out from the sky, and we use a little bit of flash to pop out our subjects. Here as well, the same kind of idea. We use our flash in the front to create some mottled light, and we're using a slow shutter speed to bring out all this ambient light in the background. One more example, using a slow shutter speed to bring out the beautiful texture of the sky, the low ambient light, while using a flash from behind to bring out our subjects. Now, of course, when we don't use a slow shutter speed, we're left with what I call a Facebook picture, meaning a picture that most people take with their little point and shoots, and that's a photograph that looks like this. A photograph that has a lot of flash from the front. The shutter speed is very high, so we don't have a lot of ambient light in the picture. The contrast is terrible. The balance of the background to the foreground is terrible. It's just an overall horrible photograph. And now this is one thing as a professional photographer that your clients don't realize, but they're going to be paying you for. And that is to decide what shutter speed we want to use to get an amazing picture. Now, why is it that a lot of the point and shoot cameras don't shoot with a slow shutter speed when they use flash? Well, the reason is because they're basically concerned with what I call the grandma mentality. Now, grandma wants a nice picture of her family gathering, whatever. What's the most important thing to her? Is the most important thing that you have a beautiful exposure of the foreground and background and everything looks great? No, the main thing she's worried about is that she has a photograph that's sharp. Now, blurry photographs with grandma are going to be the #1 mood killer when she's taking a picture, which will, of course, relate to a lot of returned cameras from the electronics store. So that's why a lot of camera manufacturers always try to shoot with the fastest shutter speed possible, so grandmas don't get a lot of blurry pictures. So that's where you, as a professional photographer, are able to create image that many people can't create with just their iPhones, etc. So let's see a few more examples now of combining flash and ambient light, and let's decide if we're going to be using a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. So anytime the sun is above the horizon, generally speaking, we're going to be using a fast shutter speed. Here's a case where we're using a slow shutter speed, 1/25, to bring in all this ambient light in the background. Here we are again at 1/4 of a second to bring in all the beautiful ambient light in the background. This prevents, again, the idea of having a terrible black background like we saw before. Here we are at a fast shutter speed to reduce the amount of ambient light in the background to prevent getting a white sky and help create a beautiful photograph. Sun is still above the horizon. That means we're going to need to crunch our shutter. Whereas here, very late at night, we're going to be all the way down at 1/15 to allow all this beautiful ambient light in the back to come in. Here we are again with a slow shutter speed. Here the shutter speed is 1/3 of a second to really enable all this amazing ambient light to come in to create a beautiful image. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you today. Obviously, there are a lot of things that we still need to learn in order to create beautiful and wow images with our flash. But this has been a great introduction to understanding the nature of the flash, and it's going to be the foundations for using flash in the future to create amazing images. I'm Yirmiyahu Van. I'll see you next time.